It was upon a dreary morning in the early weeks of October that I found myself once more seated across from Sherlock Holmes, in our familiar quarters at 221B Baker Street. A dense London fog had rolled in during the night, and now hung in the air like a sullen curtain, muting both sound and colour. The world beyond our window was but a suggestion, blurred outlines of hansom cabs, indistinct forms of passing pedestrians, and the glow of street lamps that struggled in vain against the gloom. Holmes had taken to the corner seat by the hearth, his long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp eyes fixed not on the street below, but on the fire's flickering dance. The crackle of the logs, the ticking of the mantel clock, and the rustle of newsprint were the only sounds to be heard. It was the sort of morning when London seemed to hold its breath, as though awaiting the turn of some invisible key. I had been browsing the morning edition of the Times when Holmes stirred at last. With his customary precision, he reached for a folded newspaper not from my stack, but one that had been left, rather carelessly I thought, on the doorstep earlier that morning. It bore a smudge along its lower margin, the mark of a gloved thumb hastily removed. Holmes examined it with a brief, hawk-like glance, and offered one of those dry smiles that always signalled the workings of his formidable mind. "You will observe, Watson," he said, holding the paper aloft, "that our forthcoming visitor has already reconsidered the purpose of his call." "Indeed," I replied, setting down my own paper. "And you divine this from a smudge?" "Not merely a smudge, but its placement. Note, the left thumbprint along the obituary column, precisely beneath the entry for a certain Algernon P. Goddard. The ink is fresh, the thumb gloved, and the fold reversed, clearly adjusted with nervous haste. Our man stood at the door, read the death notice, and very nearly rang the bell. Something in that announcement changed his mind. "But he hasn't arrived," I protested. "He has not yet rung," Holmes corrected me. Footsteps lingered upon the steps, 2 paces to the left, 1 to the right. He is pacing now, uncertain. No sooner had he spoken than a soft rap sounded at the door, almost tentative in nature. Holmes gave a curt nod. And now, the game begins. The man who entered was of middle age, though care had etched him into seeming older. His frock coat bore the sheen of careful maintenance, and his gloves, though of good leather, were cracked at the fingers. He removed his hat with hesitation, revealing hair greying prematurely at the temples. His manner was courteous, yet tinged with apprehension, like a schoolboy called before the headmaster. "I believe I have come in error," he began, casting his eyes toward the coat rack, as if already preparing his departure. Holmes gestured to the chair. "Do sit down, Mr. Horace Guilford. The decision is yours, of course. But having braved the fog and contemplated our threshold for no less than 6 minutes, I suspect your doubts warrant at least 5 more. The man blinked. "You know my name?" "You had it printed discreetly on the corner of your handkerchief, which you used while pacing outside. The fabric bears the imprint of yesterday's ledger ink, commercial grade, not from a fountain pen. Your right cuff, frayed slightly, indicates frequent desk work. A man who reads obituaries with gloved hands is not mourning, but fearing recognition. You are not here as a mourner, but as a man concerned with what the dead might reveal." Mr. Guilford sat down heavily, all colour draining from his face. "You are not the man I expected, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "Few ever are," Holmes replied. "But I dare say you did not come to discuss that, and yet I sense the matter you carry has taken on a weight you are no longer prepared to shoulder." The man swallowed, then stood. "I beg your pardon. I should not have come." And before either Holmes or I could press him further, he bowed stiffly and vanished into the fog. Holmes did not rise. He merely leaned back and laced his fingers once more, his eyes distant now, as though staring through the wall into some mental theatre of possibility. "You will not pursue him?" I asked, rising from my chair. "There is no need," Holmes murmured. "He will return, or he will be returned, by conscience, circumstance, or fear." The fog beyond the window had grown thicker, the gaslights now glowing like half-buried lanterns beneath a shroud. The silence that followed was not the quietude of peace, but that curious kind which often precedes the rumble of thunder. "That man is not only frightened," Holmes added. "He is torn." I said nothing, sensing his mood. Holmes often waxed contemplative in the interludes between puzzles. Yet there was a particular gravity about him that morning. The silence in the room no longer seemed idle. It held a kind of breathless waiting. As the clock chimed the hour, Holmes stood and crossed to the window, where he gazed into the mist-veiled street. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are moments when the world shifts without sound. A truth, long buried, begins to stir, unearthed not by force, but by the weight of time." I looked up from my chair. "Do you sense such a moment now?" He did not turn. "I do not sense it, my dear fellow. I smell it. The air has changed." And with that, we waited for the return of a man who had not truly left. The man who returned to Baker Street not 2 hours after his first departure was, to my eyes, already transformed by the burden he carried. Though his step was measured and his dress tidy, a grey wool coat, plainly stitched and respectfully worn, his countenance betrayed a soul deeply troubled. The shadows beneath his eyes were not the residue of poor sleep alone, but of conscience wrestled with and left unresolved. He removed his hat with a kind of mechanical politeness, and I noted that his gloves, though clean, bore the marks of anxious tugging at the fingertips. Holmes regarded him with the calm of a man whose expectations had been quietly confirmed. He made no greeting, nor did he rise, but gestured lightly toward the vacant chair near the hearth. The man hesitated, then sat, and in that single motion, I thought, yielded himself to a current from which there could be no easy return. "My name," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "is Horace Guilford. I am the senior bookkeeper for the law offices of Tilney and Braithwaite." Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing. "The matter which brings me here is of an internal nature," Guilford continued. "It concerns our firm's archival cellar, where our oldest financial records and closed cases are stored. Most have lain undisturbed for decades. Closed cases are stored. Most have lain undisturbed for decades." He paused to draw a narrow breath. "3 nights ago, during my routine stock audit, I noticed something amiss. The cellar door, usually locked and secure, was found ajar. Upon inspection, I discovered that nothing appeared stolen. The shelves remained in their usual disorder, and no locks had been broken. Yet something was disturbed," Holmes said quietly. Guilford nodded. One ledger, marked 1867, had been pulled from its place. Dust displaced, the leather binding freshly smudged. It had been opened and returned, but not in quite the same condition. I could not say whether pages were removed, but I felt, that it had been studied closely. "A curious choice," Holmes murmured. "An account book, long retired. What sort of entries did it contain?" "Names, sir. Names and codes. Payments made to individuals no longer living, many of whom were never publicly associated with our firm. I had never looked closely at it before." "And now?" Holmes prompted. "Now I fear what I have seen cannot be unseen." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving our visitor's troubled face. "And you believe the intruder copied something from it?" "I do," Guilford answered, almost in a whisper. There were slight indentations on the pages, as though someone had leaned on the paper while transcribing notes. One page, had a small tear in the lower margin, which had not been there previously. It was careless work, but hasty rather than incompetent. And yet you say nothing was taken? Nothing obvious. I conducted a full inventory. The ledger itself remains. But I cannot escape the sense that its contents were the true target. Holmes steepled his fingers. And who, do you suppose, would benefit from resurrecting such records? Guildford hesitated, his lips tightening, as though the mere contemplation of the question caused him discomfort. I do not know, but I could see he lied. Or at least concealed something. I see, Holmes replied. And what has prompted you to seek my assistance, Mr. Guildford, if no crime has been committed, and nothing, at least overtly, stolen? Because I believe someone wished me to find it, or rather, to realize it had been found, and I fear I may know why. Holmes made no reply, his silence deliberate. It invited, but did not compel the man to continue. It is not merely an account book, Guildford said at last, his voice taut with emotion. The names it records, some of them I recognized. They belong to men who held posts not just in commerce or law, but within certain circles of influence. Circles we were never meant to audit. Holmes gave the faintest nod. And yet you did, Guildford lowered his eyes. Years ago, when I was a junior clerk, I was sworn, informally but with great gravity, to ignore certain entries and binders in the firm's lower archive. They were handled only by the senior partner, Sir Lionel Braithwaite, and then only on rare occasions. I obeyed. For decades, I obeyed. And now? Guildford looked up, his expression hollow. Now the world I swore to protect has shifted beneath me. Some of the men named are dead, others disgraced, and still others, worshipped by the public as paragons. If those records were to be published, the ruin would not be financial, Mr. Holmes. It would be reputational, institutional. The edifice would crumble. And yet, Holmes said, you are here. Because someone has broken that oath, and if I do not act, I may be blamed for what follows, or worse, destroyed alongside it. The silence in the room was heavy, charged not with mystery alone, but with the tremor of a truth too large to speak. Holmes observed Guildford with quiet intensity. The man's composure, though outwardly intact, bore the marks of strain only the most practiced eye might detect. The slight tremble in his right hand as he adjusted his cuff. The way he swallowed before each answer, as if bracing himself against consequence, and the momentary lapse in breath whenever Braithwaite's name arose. I, too, felt a sense of something fragile, teetering on the edge, guilt not born of malice, but of knowledge withheld too long. You have not slept well, Holmes said at last. No, Guildford admitted, and I do not expect to. You are not a man who court scandal. You are a man who was loyal, until that loyalty turned to fear. Am I correct? Guildford did not answer, but in that moment I saw the faintest nod. When the man had gone, his posture stooped, his gait reluctant, Holmes remained in his chair, his gaze fixed upon the closed door. Tilney and Braithwaite, he murmured. I have not heard that name in 10 years, and now, like the ledger itself, it resurfaces. I straightened in my seat. You believe there is danger in this, Holmes? There is depth, Watson. And where there is depth, there is always pressure. He stood abruptly, reaching for his walking stick. Come, we must pay a visit to the past. And with that, we stepped once more into the fog-laden streets, toward a truth disturbed, and a silence no longer safe. Tilney and Braithwaite, solicitors by long-standing reputation and appearance alike, was housed in a structure that seemed as much a monument as a place of business. Its weathered facade of Portland stone bore the soot stains of 100 London winters, and its gables, Narrow-paned windows and stern ironwork exhaled an air of long-settled solemnity. It was the kind of building one does not enter without a subconscious straightening of the back, as though the very stones demanded discretion and decorum. We were received not by a footman or clerk, but by Mr. Guilford himself, who met us within the vestibule and led us, wordlessly, through a succession of dimly lit halls. His bearing was quieter now, subdued to a degree that struck me as the product not of shame, but reverence for what lay ahead. "I have informed no one of your visit," he said, pausing before a heavy door reinforced with blackened iron. "This key remains solely in my possession. The partners have no cause to monitor these archives. They are presumed settled." Holmes merely nodded, his gaze fixed not on Guilford, but upon the rusted hinge and the faint scuff upon the floor, as though already counting steps no one else had taken. We descended a narrow staircase, lit only by the flickering flame of a hand-held lantern which Guilford bore. The air grew steadily cooler, and with it came the unmistakable scent of damp stone, paper dust, and the mildew of decades. The cellar beneath Tilney and Braithwaite was not a single chamber, but rather a low-ceilinged labyrinth of alcoves, each crammed with shelves that bowed under the weight of leather-bound volumes, file boxes tied with faded ribbon, and iron chests marked with painted numerals. "This is the firm's memory," Guilford said softly, "or its conscience, depending upon your view." We followed him through the narrow aisle to a shelf near the furthest wall. He knelt, withdrawing a single volume, a thick ledger bound in burgundy calfskin, its edges frayed, its clasp tarnished but unbroken. "This," he said, rising and laying the book upon a nearby desk, "is the one that was disturbed. The others remain untouched." Holmes ran a finger gently along the spine, then opened the cover with care. The pages within bore the yellowing tint of time, yet the entries were, surprisingly, legible. Each line was penned in a neat, hand-scripted column, names on the left, numbers on the right, and occasional initials between them that likely denoted classification or purpose. There was no preamble, no ledger title or index. It was a book that made no claim of context, only record. I noticed Holmes had drawn a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and now pressed it gently against the inside binding. When he drew it back, I saw faint traces of soot and something more, an oily residue, not yet dried. "Someone has handled this recently," Holmes said, "with neither gloves nor restraint." Holmes paged slowly through the volume, pausing occasionally to make note of specific entries. Many of the names were unfamiliar to me: James F. Dunscombe, Almeric Bexley, E.R. Mount, while others bore titles or suffixes that hinted at nobility or military standing. The figures beside them varied widely, some modest, others absurdly generous for the era. The codes, initialed in ink more faded than the names themselves, remained inscrutable. "I take it this ledger does not correspond with any official client accounts?" Holmes asked. Guilford shook his head. "None that I have ever reconciled. These entries were sealed away well before I entered the firm. I believe they were handled by Sir Lionel personally." At that moment, Holmes halted. His hand, which had moved methodically across the page, now hovered. There, faintly circled in a hand less steady than the others, was a name written in precisely the same style as the rest. A. R. Goddard. Holmes tapped the name with the tip of his finger. "And this?" Guilford leaned in. "The mark is not original. I did not notice it until the break-in. It was made with a dull graphite pencil. Modern. Likely H.B. Holmes did not speak. But I recognized the furrow of his brow and the quiet flaring of his nostrils. signs that his mind had seized upon some internal connection not yet ready for the telling. "It is a peculiar thing," he said finally, "to find one ghost circled among hundreds. Whoever marked this name did so with intent, either to remember or to erase." Holmes closed the ledger and laid it aside with deliberate care. He now turned his attention to the surface of the desk where it had rested, brushing his fingers along the wood and peering beneath the edge of the shelf above. From within his coat, he produced a small magnifying lens and leaned in. "Wax," he murmured. "A thin smear, less than a half-inch across, and white in composition, likely from a candle with a low burning point." "Is that significant?" I asked. "It is significant enough that Mr. Guilford uses a lantern, not a candle," Holmes replied. "And the firm has been electrified above ground. This wax was left by someone improvising in darkness, anxious not to be heard." He stood and turned to the stone flooring. At first, it appeared uniform in its dust-laden dullness, but Holmes moved with purpose toward the left corner of the room and gestured downward. Faint marks, mere distortions in the settled powder, could be discerned. "Boot prints," he observed. "Not yours, Mr. Guilford, unless you wear a size 11 and habitually favor your left foot." Guilford paled but said nothing. Holmes then knelt beside the stair. There, upon the second step, he retrieved a small object. It was a brass button, slightly dulled but intact, bearing a crest whose details I could not immediately discern. "This was not here before," Guilford said quietly. "Indeed," Holmes answered, slipping the button into his pocket. "But it is now." And with that, he turned back to the ledger with a gaze that burned more brightly than the lantern itself. The brass button Holmes retrieved from the base of the cellar stair was, to the casual observer, no more than a common fastener, unremarkable in design save for a faint crest pressed into its surface. Yet I had learned long ago that Holmes regarded such trifles not as curiosities, but as potential fulcrums upon which an entire case might turn. Without breaking the rhythm of his investigation, he slipped the item into the inner pocket of his coat, his movement as fluid and unobtrusive as a pianist shifting between keys. He offered no comment to either Guilford or myself, but I recognized the gleam in his eye. Here was a clue of subtle value, one whose significance he had not yet disclosed, but which he would store, like a ciphered note, until its hour came due. We made no further remark upon it then, but the cellar felt less silent thereafter. Our departure from the cellar was met by the polite attentions of a young man who introduced himself as Mr. Elias Blevins, junior clerk to the firm. He had evidently been apprised of our presence by someone in the upper offices, and had taken it upon himself to make our acquaintance. "I had no idea we were entertaining such distinguished guests," he said, with a practised smile. "If I can be of any assistance, gentlemen, do say the word." Holmes regarded him with a courteous nod. "A pleasure, Mr. Blevins. You are well acquainted with the firm's lower records." "Not directly, sir. I am only 3 years at Tilney and Braithwaite, and the cellar archives are rarely touched, except by Mr. Guilford." His voice was smooth, his diction rehearsed. But his hands, tightly clasped and flexing at the knuckles, told a story his words would not. Holmes stepped closer. "You were present the day the cellar was discovered open." "I was, sir. I saw Mr. Guilford returning from it. He looked rather pale, if I may say so." "Did you accompany him down?" "No, sir. He prefers to conduct his inventory alone." Holmes offered a gentle smile. "Quite right. Some ledgers are more loyal than others." Blevins blinked, uncertain. "I beg your pardon?" "Merely a metaphor, Mr. Blevins." We took our leave soon after, and as we stepped into the corridor, Holmes murmured, just low enough for my ears alone, "The tongue lies, Watson, but the hands, rarely." That evening, seated once more within the familiar sanctuary of our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes returned to the name circled in the ledger, A.R. Goddard. The light of the fire danced upon his features as he thumbed through an assortment of aged newspaper clippings, government registry extracts, and private correspondence from his well-curated files. "Goddard," he said at last, "is no ghost. He is a shadow." I looked up from the notes I'd been reviewing. Meaning that the man who bore that name never existed in the sense you or I do. He was, in fact, an alias, used by a field courier in service to the Home Office during the latter years of the Mutiny in India. His true identity was known only to a handful of civil servants and senior military men. He operated in the gaps between departments. Reliable, discreet. He operated in the gaps between departments. Reliable, discreet, and never acknowledged on paper. A phantom in service of empire. And what role did he play in this ledger? Holmes drew out one slip of parchment, its edges brittle with age. According to this memorandum from 1871, payments were routed through private firms to fund unofficial operations in the colonies, bribes, ransom, even rewards for intelligence. Some of these transactions were too delicate to pass through the Treasury. Goddard's name appears alongside one such disbursement. To Tilney and Braithwaite. Holmes nodded. Buried within the accounts of an otherwise innocuous real estate transaction. It seems our Mr. Guilford's fears were not misplaced. I leaned back, unsettled by the breadth of implication. Then the ledger may contain not only forgotten sums but buried sins, Holmes finished. Holmes stood, his posture stiffening, as thought turned inward. He walked to the window, gazing out into the gaslit street with that familiar stillness I had come to associate with mental upheaval. "There is a name," he said quietly, "that has yet to reappear, though its shadow lingers." I waited, knowing better than to press him mid-process. "Sir Lionel Braithwaite," he continued. "He was not merely a founding partner of the firm. During his younger years, he served as private secretary to the Under-Secretary of State for India. His proximity to certain operations, clandestine, diplomatic, and otherwise, was no accident. Then you believe he may be connected to the payments in the ledger?" Holmes turned from the window. "I believe he authorized them." "But Guilford said Sir Lionel is no longer active in the firm." Holmes nodded. "Retired, and by all accounts, declining in mind. He is said to suffer from a softening of the brain, what the medical journals now refer to as cerebral atrophy, a condition that leaves the present hazy, but often preserves the past in crystalline clarity." I caught his meaning. "Then he may recall details others have forgotten." "Or wish forgotten," Holmes said. "It is time we paid him a visit." And with that he reached for his coat, not out of haste, but with the gravity of a man preparing to disturb a very old and sleeping truth. The more Holmes studied the name A.R. Goddard, the more his manner grew still, contemplative. That evening he returned from a visit to the Foreign Office with a stack of yellowing registry slips, each one bearing dates, ciphers, and the cold imprints of bureaucratic discretion. I watched as he compared each record to the names circled faintly in the ledger, his expression drawn and precise. "Watson," he said at last, "we deal not merely with a cipher of finance, but with a ghost conjured by politics." He laid one document upon the table between us. It was marked "Confidential, for internal eyes only," and bore a date from 1867. Goddard, Holmes continued, was not a man in the traditional sense, but an identity, a mask used by a courier who moved between departments during the tail end of the Indian Mutiny. He conveyed sensitive communications and arranged disbursements meant never to appear in any ledger. And yet, here he is. You believe he was a government agent? Undoubtedly, but not the sort with medals or memoirs, The kind who, when his use was finished, vanished, not erased by death, but by deliberate omission. There was a chill in the room that had not come from the hearth. Holmes returned to the ledger with a reverence that verged upon wariness. With the aid of a magnifying glass, he traced his gloved fingers across several pages, cross-referencing amounts and initials that had seemed innocuous mere days before. A pattern began to emerge, faint but undeniable. "These entries," he murmured, "are not bribes in the vulgar sense. They are assurances. Funds moved through layers of fictitious names, paid to those whose silence or cooperation was essential." "To maintain what?" I asked. "To prevent collapse," Holmes replied. "Reputation, perhaps. More likely trust in a regime. These were the years when rebellion abroad strained the loyalties of men at home. To contain that tension, one must purchase allegiance, or, at the very least, complicity. And Tilney and Braithwaite served as the conduit. Legal documentation offers the best camouflage. A firm of such standing could bury scandal beneath formal language and neat columns. And Guilford, though not the architect, became the unwilling archivist of empire's quiet sins." He turned another page and paused. "Note the adjustment here. An amount altered, then corrected, but not by the same hand." "A forgery?" I asked. "A tremor," Holmes said, "of guilt or fear." We had arranged to meet Mr. Guilford again the following morning. The hour came and passed. No word arrived. Concerned, we visited his lodgings in Kensington. A landlady of respectable bearing informed us that Mr. Guilford had left quite early, suitcase in hand and coat buttoned all the way to the collar, despite the mildness of the weather. "I thought it odd," she told us, "for he took nothing but one valise, and he's a man of paper and order, not one to depart in haste." We were allowed inside his modest suite. Holmes moved quickly but without disturbance, examining the dressing table, wastebasket, and writing desk. A single drawer lay half open, as if closed in haste. A shirt collar sat folded upon the bed, clean, unused. "Look here," Holmes said, indicating a blotter pad. Beneath its parchment lay the faint imprint of recent writing, the lines staggered and anxious. With the use of a pencil, he revealed a few half-phrases. "Cannot delay. They will find out. Forgive me for what must." He stepped back. He is not running to safety. He is running from a reckoning. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest. "You believe he is in danger?" "I believe," said Holmes grimly, "that he already was." It was just after tea when the telegram arrived. Holmes read it, folded it, and without a word handed it to me. "Blevins found beaten, barely alive, flat in Chelsea. Jap." We made our way at once to the address. The junior clerk's rooms were modest but orderly, with signs of disturbance near the writing desk, papers scattered, an ink bottle overturned, and a chair lying on its side. Mr. Blevins himself was unconscious in the bedroom, his face bruised and lips bloodied. A physician tended to him, nodding grimly when we entered. "Someone meant to kill him," the doctor said. "Only didn't stay long enough to ensure the task." Holmes studied the scene with detached intensity. He knelt beside the desk, lifting a torn scrap of paper from beneath the skirting board. Written upon it, in a shaky hand, were the letters "A.R.Go." Before the ink ran into a smear. "Too convenient," Holmes muttered. "You think the attack's staged?" I asked. "Not staged," he replied, "but directed. Someone feared what he overheard, and decided silence was worth the risk." He stood. "But the haste speaks of fear. The enemy is growing desperate." As we left the flat, I could no longer suppress a theory that had been taking shape in my mind. "Holmes," I said, "what if Blevins is not the victim but the perpetrator?" His nervous hands, his polished speech, he might have engineered the break-in, then feigned innocence. Holmes did not look at me, but his lips curved in a faint, almost pitying smile. "My dear Watson," he said, "you are not the first to be seduced by a tidy suspicion. But tell me, does a junior clerk with no access to the cellar possess the means to pass through an iron lock, disturb a single volume among hundreds, and leave without detection?" I said nothing. "Precisely," Holmes continued. "Blevins is eager and frightened, but not skilled. The intrusion bore precision, restraint, and knowledge of what to seek. No, the youth is a witness, nothing more. And Guildford is slipping beneath the surface, pulled by tides long set in motion." The fog was rising once more outside, and I sensed the case drawing not to its end, but to its perilous middle. That night, Holmes sat before the fire in his usual chair, the ledger open once more upon his knee. His eyes moved not across the page, but above it, as though seeing not the ink, but the motive behind it. "The pattern is too clear now to ignore," he said at last. "These payments, these carefully timed disbursements, were part of a system of managed silence. Men in positions of knowledge, men in possession of secrets which could undo careers or policies, were paid not merely to stay quiet, but to stay useful." "And Goddard?" I asked. "Was the courier, the go-between, a trusted spectre who could not be named and yet was known. Guildford, young at the time, likely handled these transactions without understanding. But now he knows what he carried." He stood and walked slowly to the window. "Someone is closing the curtain on this chapter, Watson. The break-in, the attack on Blevins, the disappearance of Guildford, these are not coincidences. They are the workings of a man desperate to ensure that the dust upon these records remains undisturbed. And Sir Lionel?" Holmes turned. "Either complicit or the last relic in possession of memory. We must find out which." His tone had sharpened, not with excitement, but with something closer to dread. That night, I observed in Holmes a restlessness that defied even his usual bounds. Though his form was composed and his expression unreadable, I noted how often he rose, only to sit again, how his hand hovered over the violin without drawing bow across string. At one point, I found him gazing at a half-burnt telegram in the hearth. He did not speak, nor did I ask its contents. I knew that look. It was the one he wore only when past and present touched, when some old failure, unspoken and unhealed, stirred beneath his logic. There are few things Holmes ever called personal, but I suspected, without proof, that this case was one of them, and I feared what it might cost him before it was through. It was early on a grey Wednesday morning when Inspector Lestrade called upon Baker Street, his face taut and lined in a manner which boded no cheer. A body had been recovered from the Thames near Wapping Wharf, lodged against a moss-covered piling at the river's edge. It was, to the Yard's initial estimation, another unfortunate suicide, common enough in our city's darker hours. But the identification changed the matter entirely. The corpse was that of Mr. Horace Guildford. We accompanied Lestrade to the coroner's office, where Guildford's body lay beneath a linen sheet. The skin was pale, the lips tinged blue, yet Holmes studied the hands with unnerving intensity. "These abrasions," he murmured, indicating the fingertips, "are neither incidental nor caused by debris. The nails are broken. Note the crescent splits and embedded fibers. He fought." Lestrade frowned. "Could be river flotsam." Holmes shook his head. "The tide may take, but it does not break fingernails upward." There was also a contusion at the base of the neck, partially obscured by the collar. Holmes pressed gently. "Post-mortem bruising?" I asked. "Ante-mortem," Holmes replied. "Mr. Guildford did not slip beneath those waters by his own hand. He was placed there. Yet despite these signs, the official report reached the press within hours. Clark found dead. Police suspect suicide, following nervous collapse." Holmes read the headlines aloud with a bitter tone. How swiftly the machinery of denial turns, Watson. We returned to Scotland Yard that afternoon. Within the cluttered offices of Lestrade's division, Holmes confronted the inspector with restrained firmness. "I urge you to reopen the matter," he said. "Guildford's injuries are inconsistent with drowning. He was not weighed, yet his body did not drift far. There was intent in the disposal." Lestrade grunted. "You're implying murder. That's no small claim." "I imply only that the evidence speaks louder than any verdict born of convenience." The inspector sighed and glanced about to ensure no ears lingered too near. "I'll not change the record without cause, Holmes. But if you bring me something concrete, something more than scratches and suspicion, I'll listen." Holmes inclined his head. "Then listen closely. The river has told us one part of the tale. Let us see what the cloth may whisper next." That evening, in the quiet of our sitting room, Holmes laid out the small brass button he had recovered from the cellar stair, a trifle, I had thought at first, but now central to his thoughts. With a cloth and drop of oil, he cleaned the metal until its insignia emerged clear. A shield bearing the seal of Cambridge University, flanked by lions rampant and a motto in Latin half-faded by time. "Observe," Holmes said, handing me the polished disc. "These buttons are not commercially available. They are issued only to those who receive a certain class of overcoat, standard among Cambridge's elite alumni of a particular year." He rose and walked to the shelf, drawing down a thin registry. These coats were bespoke for the graduating class of 1849, and again in 1856. They were part of a ceremonial gift from the Chancellor's estate, and only a few dozen were ever produced. "And one was worn," I said slowly, "by the man who entered the cellar." "Precisely," Holmes nodded. "A man who left behind a trail too faint to notice, save for this token." "And how do we find him?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We already have." It was scarcely noon the next day when Holmes returned from his inquiries with the gravity of a man whose suspicions had found confirmation. He sat beside the hearth and opened his notebook, revealing a clipped calling card, brittle with age. "Sir Lionel Braithwaite," he said quietly. "Former senior partner. Retired some years ago to Larchmere Hollow in Sussex. He is known for having served in the India Office during the height of the Mutiny, and, importantly, is one of the few men still living who received the 1849 Cambridge ceremonial overcoat, and his connection to the ledger." "Unmistakable," Holmes replied. "It was Braithwaite who authorized the disbursements linked to the Goddard alias. He signed them in coded script, subtle but present. Furthermore, he maintained his own private filing, separate from the firm's shared archive." "What of his health?" I asked, remembering Guildford's earlier remark about Braithwaite's decline. "Reported as reclusive, suffering from intermittent senility. But those who have spoken to him say that his memories of the past remain curiously sharp, especially when they concern reputation." He closed the notebook. "Which leads me to believe he is not only aware of the ledger's contents, but terrified by them." The journey to Larchmere Hollow took us through fields touched with frost, the landscape subdued beneath a curtain of low grey cloud. The estate emerged from the mist, like a painting half forgotten, a mansion of stone and ivy, its windows shuttered, its chimneys cold. An air of solemn decay lingered about the place, as though the years themselves had taken up residence within. We were received not by a valet, but by a middle-aged housekeeper of firm countenance, who informed us that Sir Lionel would see us in his study. "If it please you, gentlemen, though his humours have turned strange of late." The interior bore signs of faded grandeur, portraits whose eyes no longer watched, rugs worn threadbare in the centre, and the hush of too many untold conversations. Braithwaite himself sat in a high-backed chair near a dim fire, swathed in a heavy wool robe, his hands resting on the arms like relics carved in stone. His eyes, though clouded with age, fixed upon us with unexpected clarity. "I know why you've come," he said without greeting. "Then you know," Holmes replied evenly, "that silence is no longer sufficient." A pause stretched thin as paper. "The past," Braithwaite said at length, "has teeth." It was in the study, a chamber of thick curtains and ancestral pride, that Holmes's gaze turned to an oil portrait above the mantel. It depicted a young Braithwaite in military uniform, eyes proud, hand resting on the hilt of a saber. "You were stationed in Delhi," Holmes observed. "I served where I was sent," came the reply. Holmes approached the frame and, without invitation, ran his fingers along the base. A faint smudge of soot clung to one side, an oddity in so tidy a room. "Watson," he murmured, "lend me your penknife." With delicate precision, he slipped the blade beneath the lower edge of the frame and pressed. A click sounded, almost inaudible. The painting swung forward on hidden hinges to reveal a shallow recess set into the wall. Within lay a bundle of yellow documents tied in faded ribbon. Bank slips, correspondence, and ledgers bearing seals of the India office. Atop them rested a single envelope, addressed in a fine trembling hand to H.G. Holmes. Retrieved the envelope and examined its seal. This was meant for Guildford. Braithwaite said nothing. His expression had gone grey, as though he had watched the ghosts of his past come to collect their debt. Holmes turned to me, voice low. "These," he said, "are not just papers, Watson. They are evidence of a pact between empire and secrecy, a record of who was bought, and at what cost. And with that, we stepped deeper into the labyrinth of a truth long buried." The following morning, I observed Holmes engaged in a singular act, penning a letter not to a colleague, nor to the Yard, but to the editor of the Morning Courier, a modest yet widely circulated daily. The tone of the letter was clinical and unembellished, though what it described was anything but mundane. "Recovered in a routine audit," Holmes dictated aloud, "the long-lost financial register of Tilney and Braithwaite, allegedly destroyed in the fires of 1882, has come to light. Though aged, the entries remain legible, and one page in particular, bearing the name A.R. Goddard, has drawn quiet but urgent attention from Westminster officials." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean to provoke him?" Holmes nodded. "Desperation uncovers what scrutiny may not. If our adversary believes that the records have not only survived but are now being studied, he will act. And when he does, he will reveal himself more fully than any confession." The article ran the next morning in a tucked corner of the third page. Innocuous to the casual reader, it bore all the subtle menace that Holmes intended. And by nightfall, we were preparing once more for an unspoken war. That evening, cloaked in the gloom of the law firm's narrow corridor, Holmes and I concealed ourselves within a disused records chamber adjoining the firm's lower cellar. The scent of old parchment and mildew pervaded the space, yet Holmes remained still as stone, listening to each creak and settling groan of the timbers above. "We are not hunting a common thief," he whispered. "We await a man who comes not for gain, but erasure." I carried no firearm, only a stout walking stick, while Holmes had brought with him the decoy ledger, its pages meticulously forged to replicate the original. With one critical exception, it bore a hidden chemical compound that would stain the fingers of any who handled it. Hours passed. The gaslights beyond the shutters dimmed, and the city's pulse quieted to a murmur. Midnight approached. Then, faintly, came the sound, a key turning in the outer door. Holmes did not speak. He merely touched my arm and nodded once toward the adjoining wall, his breath measured and eyes unblinking. In that moment, I realized the cellar was not merely haunted by secrets, It was baited with them. The door to the archive groaned open, and a shadowed figure stepped cautiously into the gloom. Cloaked in a long overcoat, his gait bore the weight of age, yet urgency marked each step. He moved straight to the ledger placed atop the cellar desk, lit a candle from his pocket, and began to scan its pages with shaking hands. Holmes gave no signal. He did not need to. We stepped from our concealment as one. "Good evening, Sir Lionel," Holmes said evenly. The figure froze, then turned, face ashen, mouth set in a grim line. There was no pretense of surprise, only the exhausted posture of a man cornered by inevitability. "You were warned," Holmes continued, "by the paper, by circumstance, and by your own conscience. And yet you came." Braithwaite's hand moved toward the ledger, perhaps to snatch it, perhaps to destroy it, but Holmes had already crossed the room and placed a firm hand upon the man's shoulder. "It is a copy," he said calmly. "The original resides elsewhere. Your actions tonight speak volumes more than any document." For a moment, Sir Lionel's eyes burned with something like fury, but it faded quickly, replaced by a silence that carried the weight of years. In the half-light of the cellar, Holmes stood opposite Braithwaite, his tone gentle but resolute. "The trap was never meant to shame you publicly," he said, "but to draw the truth from hiding." Braithwaite sagged slightly, his hand resting on the back of the chair beside him. He no longer attempted to argue nor deny. "I knew it must surface," he muttered. "I had only hoped it would be after I had gone." Holmes handed him a cloth and gestured toward his fingers. "The ink compound will not fade for several days. You may wish to avoid shaking hands in polite society." That remark, laced with dry irony, passed without reaction. Braithwaite looked at the decoy ledger, then away, as if its very presence scorched his vision. "You still possess the real pages?" he asked. Holmes gave a small nod. "Then I am undone." "No, Sir Lionel," Holmes replied. "You were undone the moment you placed silence above the law. What follows is merely the echo." Braithwaite said nothing more. But in the stillness, something in him cracked. Not in rage, but in resignation. We returned with Sir Lionel to the private office above, where a single decanter of brandy remained untouched upon the mantel. He poured himself a measure, but did not drink. Instead, he turned to us with a gaze stripped of defense. "It was during the worst of it," he began. "Delhi had fallen. Blood was currency. To hold the country together, we bribed men who might otherwise rebel, not with coin alone, but with promises, prestige, silence, favor. The Goddard alias was our courier. He made the deliveries. I authorized them." Holmes sat quietly, hands steepled beneath his chin. "The recipients?" he asked. Braithwaite looked down. "Lords, bishops, men whose names decorate hospital wings and museums today. Exposure would not hurt them now. It would unravel everything built atop that lie." "And Guildford?" I pressed. "A boy at the time, sharp-eyed, loyal. He found the ledger years later and brought it to me. I told him it was best left forgotten, but he grew curious, began asking questions. Perhaps he meant to confess. I don't know." "You knew someone would come after it," Holmes said. Braithwaite closed his eyes. "And I knew I'd be forced to act." Holmes rose and approached the window, looking out over the street, his face cast in soft reflection. For a moment none of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You feared not justice, but disintegration, the unraveling of reputation, of history itself." Braithwaite, seated once more, did not deny it. "I spent my life preserving institutions," he said hoarsely. "One ripple, one accusation, and the public would turn on all of it, on everything we safeguarded." "But at what cost?" I asked, unable to restrain my voice. "Guildford is dead." Braithwaite's shoulders shook. He was like a son to me. I never meant for him to die. Only to scare him. To buy time. Someone else. Someone I trusted must have gone further. Holmes turned, his voice now firm but not cruel. The ledger was your legacy, Sir Lionel, but it became your indictment. Fear kept you from the truth, and fear made you dangerous. Braithwaite did not weep, but his gaze dropped to his hands, still faintly stained with the chemical from the decoy ledger. What happens now? He asked. Holmes looked at me before replying. That depends upon Scotland Yard, and the secrets Whitehall wishes buried. We stood once more in the pale light of morning, this time upon the threshold of Scotland Yard. Sir Lionel Braithwaite, dignified even in resignation, said nothing as Holmes stepped forward and addressed Inspector Lestrade in the most measured of tones. You will find the necessary corroboration among the documents I shall shortly deliver, Holmes said. I trust Sir Lionel shall be afforded the discretion due to his rank, even in disgrace. Lestrade, who had long grown accustomed to Holmes's peculiar methods, nodded grimly. He'll be kept apart, quietly. I've no taste for scandal, and I doubt Whitehall would appreciate one. Sir Lionel cast Holmes a glance not of gratitude, but of weary understanding. There was a kind of stoic pride in the man still, as if he faced not condemnation, but some long-postponed reckoning. You could have destroyed the documents, he murmured. Holmes replied without warmth. I do not deal in erasure, Sir Lionel, only in order. A constable stepped forward to escort the old man within. Braithwaite did not resist, nor did he offer a final word. He simply walked into the grey corridors of the yard, like a man stepping into the history he had so long delayed. Later that day, I accompanied Holmes to a quiet mews off Pall Mall, far removed from the clamour of Fleet Street. He carried with him a satchel containing the authentic documents, aged ledgers, correspondence, memoranda inked with faded signatures, and the original entries tied to A.R. Goddard. We were received without question by a severe-looking clerk, and ushered into a modest office, where a tall gentleman in an unmarked waistcoat awaited us. His bearing bespoke the civil service rather than the constabulary, a man whose authority lay not in badge or title, but in the unspoken machinery of government. Mr. Holmes, he said, extending a hand, we were told to expect you. I trust, Holmes replied, laying the satchel on the table, that these will be treated with the gravity they deserve. The gentleman inclined his head. They will be sealed, catalogued, and stored securely. Access restricted. No public record? I asked. Certainly not, the man replied. What these pages contain belongs not in the court of opinion, but in the vault of memory. Holmes watched as the satchel was placed within a black box and secured with 2 brass locks. With that, the past was once again buried, this time by quiet hands in quiet halls. That evening, as the wind whispered outside our Baker Street lodgings and the fire cast long shadows across the hearthrug, I turned to Holmes with a question that had troubled me all day. Is it justice, I asked, when a man like Guildford is murdered and the truth of it interred behind locked drawers? Holmes, who had been smoking in silence for nearly an hour, lifted his gaze from the coals. What would you have had done, Watson? Public scandal? The names of long-dead noblemen dragged through the mud for acts committed under orders from a crumbling crown. Guildford's death is a tragedy, yes, but justice is rarely as pristine as we wish it. And Braithwaite? He will not escape judgment. Not entirely. The machinery may grind quietly, but it grinds nonetheless. I frowned. But Guildford cannot speak for himself. No, Holmes agreed, but neither will his name be tarnished. That ledger, had it gone to the press, might have undone him too, had it been twisted. I stared into the fire and felt no warmth from it. Then silence has won. Holmes answered only with the soft strike of flint as he relit his pipe. The hour grew late, and the quiet of Baker Street pressed in around us. Holmes sat by the window, pipe in hand, eyes lost in the London fog that had returned, draping the street in a hush not unlike reverence. "Watson," he said at last, "there is a myth that truth is always the highest good. But truth, like fire, may illuminate or consume." He turned toward me, and though his expression was calm, there was something burdened in the set of his mouth. "We deal not merely in crimes, but in equilibrium. The truth of this case might have stirred old embers into dangerous flame. I chose silence, not to protect the guilty, but to preserve the fragile scaffolding upon which peace often rests." I remained silent, unsure whether to agree or protest. Holmes looked back toward the glass. "Justice, my dear Watson, is often weighed against the tremors it might cause. Justice, my dear Watson, is often weighed against the tremors it might cause." The fog deepened, and outside, the street lamps flickered like distant memories. I knew then that Holmes would not speak of this case again. Not because he was indifferent, but because even the sharpest mind must, at times, bow before the necessities of a world built on secrets. We had returned to Baker Street, that modest sanctuary where so many riddles had been born and resolved. The gas lamp burned low, and Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, the firelight tracing a muted glow along the carved edges of his features. I watched him in silence for several minutes, knowing well that a storm of deduction was settling into its final, still pattern. With a sigh that was almost contented, Holmes reached for the poker and stirred the coals absently. "You have questions, Watson," he said, not looking at me. "I can see them circling in your mind like hounds too well trained to bark." I nodded. "Not questions, Holmes. Fragments. I suspect you are about to arrange them into a picture far more complete than I imagined." He inclined his head. "Let us begin, then, with the cry for help that no one but a guilty man would have overlooked." Holmes reached for a slim leather-bound volume resting on the table beside him, the infamous ledger. He opened it with care, leafing to a particular page, and tapped his long finger on the faint pencil line scrawled in the margin. "A clumsy mark, one might think," he said. But in truth, Guilford placed it here with deliberate restraint. It was not a note to himself. It was a signal to me. I examined the smudge again, now with fuller understanding. "Why not come to you plainly?" "Because he could not," Holmes replied. His conscience warred with his fear. He wished to expose the truth, but dreaded the consequences. The mark served two purposes. It would alert me if I were called to the scene, and it would be subtle enough to escape the notice of those watching him. "A desperate man," I murmured. Holmes nodded, and desperation is often written in the margins. "He was not the only one to visit the cellar," Holmes continued. "Note the wax droplet here on the floor plan, traced near the ledger's position, and the overlapping boot prints in the fine layer of dust." "You measured them?" I asked. "Of course. 2 distinct sets, Guilford's naturally, and another, lighter, narrower. That second belonged to a man trying to disguise his tread. He failed. The residue of candle wax told me that he came in darkness, and the misaligned prints told me he returned more than once. So it could not have been Guilford alone," I concluded. "Precisely. Nor Blevins. The stride was wrong. No, this was a man of experience, who had moved quietly in more perilous rooms. A man with something to hide, and every reason to retrieve or destroy a record that never should have survived the century. Sir Lionel Braithwaite." Holmes simply smiled and turned a page. Holmes drew a small velvet pouch from the desk drawer and tipped its contents gently onto the table. Out fell the brass button, worn, slightly tarnished, but unmistakably embossed with the arms of St. John's College, Cambridge. "This, my dear Watson, sealed the matter," Holmes said. "A button found wedged beneath a stair in the cellar, quite apart from Guildford's path. Its placement implied haste, an accidental loss during the break-in. Surely others may possess such buttons. Fewer than a dozen men still living who received them in that style and year," Holmes replied. I inquired, quietly of course, and learned that Sir Lionel Braithwaite had his overcoat altered last winter, having lost a button near the hem. I stared at the object, simple yet damning. "It fastened more than cloth," I murmured. "Indeed. It fastened guilt to a man who had spent decades fastening the truth behind portraits and protocol." "Guildford's death," Holmes said, "was not born of rivalry or revenge. It was the extinguishing of a flickering conscience." I frowned. "You believe he intended to leak the contents of the ledger?" "I am certain of it. He approached a journalist under an assumed name, an act I confirmed through correspondence found later at his lodgings. But he hesitated. That hesitation became his undoing." "He turned back?" "Yes. But the damage was done. Sir Lionel, already unravelling under the strain of secrecy, feared exposure. Guildford's retreat was not enough to save him. His wavering was taken for betrayal, and the punishment was swift." I felt a chill settle in my spine. A man killed not for speaking, but for thinking too loudly. Holmes nodded gravely. "Even the whisper of truth is thunder to those who have built their legacy upon silence." "Blevins," I asked, "why harm him?" "Because he heard more than he should," Holmes replied. "A conversation, half a name perhaps. It is likely he did not even understand what he had stumbled upon. But to a man like Braithwaite, even an innocent ear can become a liability." "Then the assault was calculated, not intended to kill, only to intimidate. He shall recover, but his memory of that night remains patchy, a blessing, perhaps." "Do you believe he suspects?" "Not the whole of it, and I see no benefit in burdening him further." I nodded, feeling the moral ambiguity settle upon us like smoke. "There is one more thread," Holmes said softly, as if reluctant to tug it loose. "Among Guildford's effects I found several letters. They were written to a man named Arthur R. Goddard. The tone was not formal. It was reverent. A. R. Goddard," I said slowly, the name echoing through the chambers of my memory. "An alias," Holmes confirmed, "used by an intelligence courier who vanished during the mutiny. He once saved Guildford's life, it seems, under circumstances only hinted at in the letters. And Guildford never forgot. Number. And when he recognized that the ledger's entries pointed to Goddard's work being twisted into instruments of bribery and cover-up, he faced a crisis of conscience. To reveal the truth was to stain the name of the man he owed everything to. I stared at the fire, the heat of it no match for the chill in my chest. "He died honoring a ghost," I said. Holmes did not answer. He merely closed the ledger and turned away. Evening had drawn its quiet veil over Baker Street, softening the clatter of hooves and closing the shutters of the world beyond. Holmes sat by the window, his silhouette outlined against the last vestiges of fog, pressing like a ghost's breath upon the glass. The pipe, ever his companion in reflection, hung loosely between his fingers, its thin plume rising not in agitation, but in slow, curling thought. He had not spoken in some time, save for a clipped response when I inquired whether he would take supper. I took my usual place across from him, the fire between us casting shifting shadows on the carpet, and for a time we said nothing. Yet even silence with Holmes was seldom empty. It was, rather, the holding of breath before some inner verdict was rendered. I sensed in him a reluctance to disturb the stillness, with words not yet cooled enough to bear speaking. I watched as he tapped the bowl of his pipe, gently against the brass rim of the ashtray, his gaze unmoving from the pane. The fog outside had his gaze unmoving from the pane. The fog outside had lifted somewhat. Inside, it lingered still, in thought, in conscience, and in the quiet furrow across Holmes's brow. There are cases one remembers for the ingenuity of their villain, others for the satisfaction of their resolution. But a few linger not for the puzzle solved, but for the truths they pry loose, truths that, like the dust upon that forgotten ledger, resist every attempt to be brushed away. The ledger had not merely catalogued transactions, it had become a mirror, held up to the face of empire and duty. Names, payments, codes, each a cipher for compromise. Guildford had known this, and it had unmoored him. I found myself thinking of that cellar, a place neither sacred nor profane, yet steeped in the gravity of long-buried secrets. One man had died for them, another had killed to protect them, and in between stood Holmes, whose task it was to distinguish justice from preservation, truth from usefulness. It struck me that some books, though closed, continue to speak, and some dust, once disturbed, reveals not neglect, but intention. A ledger, yes, but also a tomb. A tomb of decisions made in silence, under the guise of stability. One need not be buried in soil to be forgotten. Paper, too, may serve as a shroud. Justice, as I had once believed in my more youthful days, was a sword held high, clean, unswerving, and absolute. But time, and Holmes, had taught me otherwise. In the dim firelight of that evening, I reflected upon Guildford's fate. A man whose crime had been hesitation, whose punishment was death. Not at the hands of a foreign assassin or rogue criminal, but by the quiet, calculated fear of a man who had once sworn to serve the law. And what had come of it? A name suppressed. A murderer, handed over not to a judge, but to the unseen machinery of Whitehall. The public would hear nothing. There would be no trial, no headlines. Guildford's death would remain as quiet as the life he had led. I turned toward Holmes then, unable to resist the ache behind my words. "Is this justice, Holmes?" He did not answer. His pipe had gone out, and he made no move to relight it. In his stillness, I read neither agreement nor defiance, but a recognition of truth's boundaries. There are walls, I realized, beyond which even Holmes cannot, or will not look. Perhaps it is not that justice fails, but that it must sometimes wear a shroud. What I could not escape, what gnawed quietly at the edges of my observation, was Holmes himself. He bore no outward sign of distress. His words, when they came, retained their characteristic poise, and yet there was a heaviness to him, an invisible ballast, as though this case had tugged on a thread too long suppressed. Holmes was not given to sentiment, but neither was he untouched by it. I had seen him, once, turn away when the cry of a widow had become too much to bear. I had heard the tremor, almost imperceptible, in his voice when recalling the Reichenbach. And now, watching him in the firelight, I suspected this case had awakened in him some ghost of personal regret. Perhaps it was the nature of the deception, the manipulation of honor in service of secrecy. Or perhaps it was the memory of a failure, unspoken and unshared, which echoed through the ledger's silent pages. I thought to speak, to ask what troubled him, but something in his expression halted me. This was a moment not for questions, but for quiet companionship. For all his brilliance, Holmes was not made of ice, and in rare stillness such as this, I glimpsed the man behind the mind. At last, he spoke. "A ledger may gather dust, Watson," he said, still facing the window. "But the past does not sleep. It waits until someone dares disturb it." The words, delivered in his usual even cadence, landed with the weight of finality. I wrote them down later, unable to shake their resonance. Holmes turned then, slowly, and met my gaze. Guildford was not a hero, nor was Braithwaite a villain. Each acted from fear, one from the fear of betraying a debt, the other from the fear of losing his life's edifice. And you? I asked. He smiled faintly. I act, my dear Watson, so that men such as they may not be left to act alone. There was silence between us once more, but it was of a gentler kind. As I rose to close the curtains, my eye caught the thin layer of London soot that had settled along the sill. Dust. Always dust. In our world of shadows and secrets, I thought, it is not the villain who fears the ledger most, but the gentleman with something to lose. And with that, I ended the page. As the last embers dimmed in the hearth, Holmes stood at the window once more, pipe in hand, his gaze fixed upon the drifting fog beyond Baker Street. It is curious, Watson, he murmured, how often we find that the past does not decay with time, but ferments. It waits, patiently, corrosively, until the seal of secrecy is loosened by guilt or fear. And then, as ever, someone must pay its price. You believe Braithwaite feared the truth more than justice? I asked. No, said Holmes, turning to me with a weary smile. He feared the collapse of a world built not upon lies, but upon omissions. And that, my dear Watson, is often far more fragile. But what about you? What do you think was the true turning point in this case? Was it Guildford's conscience, Braithwaite's desperation, or the silent weight of the past itself?